Good afternoon, everyone. We're getting started on Berkeley time, but we are getting started. We have a great discussion before us. I'm Laura Tyson. I'm serving as the interim dean at Haas. I'm delighted to welcome members of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on digital cooperation. The panel is chaired by Melinda Gates and Jack Ma. There are 20 members drawn from around the world, from a wide range of expertise. I once had the honor to work for another special high-level panel of the UN, and at their best, these are very important at providing a snapshot of where the world is on a particular topic and giving really informed expert policy advice to country leaders and to leaders of nonprofit organizations and to leaders of businesses about what to do to address a challenge. So the challenges here, of course, first of all, the opportunities, which our digital technologies have actually transformed our societies, our countries, our organizations in a very short period of time, transforming work, learning, shopping, eating, travel, search for information, sharing information, social networks. They've altered our institutions and our governance structures. I'm on the boards of several companies, and all of that work now is done electronically. Digital technologies have been hailed as the great equalizer, bringing down borders, bringing down artificial physical constraints, linking people, giving people equal access to provide opportunities for new businesses, for new modes of learning. And yet, the great equalizer, digital technologies, has also been used to isolate and discriminate, to manipulate and obfuscate information, to deepen disagreements and political divides, to concentrate power and privilege. And of course, digital technologies also have the amazing ability to really transform work so that large numbers of jobs, large numbers of economic opportunities are disappearing, while another whole set of jobs and economic opportunities are appearing. So there are many, many challenges around digital cooperation. And the basic purpose, I would say, you'll hear from the chair, but my understanding of the purpose of this high-level panel is to think about how we can use the power of these technologies to build more inclusive, more sustainable, and a juster future. That's completely consistent with the 2030 agenda of the United Nations, which is sustainable and inclusive economic growth. It's completely consistent with the University of California, Berkeley, where I think we've prided ourselves from the very beginning at creating knowledge and education to make the world a better place, to make it more sustainable, to make it more just, and to make it more inclusive. So this is a great opportunity for us to hear from members of the panel, but also they're here to hear from us. They're here because they're going around the world to collect ideas, which they will then put in a report and in a set of outreach activities. So now I'm going to invite Ambassador Amandeep Singh Gill, the Executive Director of this UN high-level panel, to begin the discussion today. Ambassador.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dean Tyson, for that warm welcome. And thank you to your team, to Professor Gupta in particular, for helping us put this together. And thank you to all the fantastic panelists who have found time from their busy schedules to help the panel with its reflections today. So it's my privilege now to introduce one of the members of the panel who would be dialing in using digital technologies to be with us today. And that is Jean Tehol. Professor Jean Tehol is chairman of the Toulouse School of Economics and the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse, which he helped found in 2011. He's also affiliated with the MIT and is a member of the French Académie des Sciences Morales et Politiques. He has published over 200 articles in international reviews, as well as 12 scientific books. His latest book, entitled Economics for the Common Good, is accessible to a wide audience. He was president of the Econometric Society in 1998 and of the European Economic Association in 2001. He has received many honors and awards. The most significant is the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2014 for his research on understanding and regulating markets. When awarding him solo the Nobel Prize, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences applauded Professor Tirol as one of the most influential economists of our times. Jean is a very active member of the panel, and he's taken the lead on the issue that we'll be discussing today, and that's building an inclusive digital economy. Bonsoir, Jean, et bienvenue.
Bonsoir, Amandu. Okay. So French is the official language, right? Can you see me and hear me? Just to.
Yes.
Is that all right? Okay, I see you loading. Okay. Technology is great. Thanks a lot for having me. I'm going to follow up on what Laura said and try to think a little bit about inclusive technology. Let me try to put on the slides. Hold on a second. That's where we are going to see if I'm a decent tech person, but now I don't find the file anymore. Okay, yes. Can you see the file? No, the slides, no. Okay, sorry. No, sorry. I did repeat earlier and it worked. I'm sorry about this terrible. I think that's the one. Can you read it? Can you see it? Okay. Can you hear me? I don't have any feedback, by the way. Okay. Okay, so let me.
Jean, c'est bon. Tu peux continuer.
Okay, so let me. I apologize. So I'm going to say a few things about inclusive technology. Let me just start by saying that inclusion has many meanings. We can be enfranchised through education, job, health, entrepreneurship, better services, but also gender equality, political enfranchisement, and so on. And it's my view, and Laura said something about it too, that it's a kind of watershed moment because those platforms, those governments are going to use big data to transform education, health, jobs, financial intermediation, consumer product and services, and also the democracy and the power of autocratic regimes is going to be changing over time. And the issue is that going to be for the better or for the worse. Of course, we could spend hours discussing those issues. Let me just concentrate on three things: finance, labor, and competition policy. And then, of course, it will be very insufficient, as you'll guess, but let me go through that. So let me start with finance. I would argue it's going to be a different world, but at the same time, the economic fundamentals apply. It's not that, all we have learned in the past has disappeared. Anytime you have technological change, it always brings about some desirable feature and has also detrimental consequences. So you'll get a cheap distribution channel in service improvement. So think about what Ant Financial is doing right now. It's just classic intermediation, but you use credit scoring for credit scoring purposes. new data. So you use data from e-commerce, supply chain, the social graphs, the payment patterns, personal traits, and so on. You use better data-driven analytics and also AI adjudication and smart contracts. So most of you probably have heard about the loans which are issued by Ant Financial to SMEs with a so-called 310 process. So it takes about 3 minutes to apply. It takes 1 second to get the answer. And of course, there is zero human being involved in the process. It's entirely big data and algorithms. And actually, it's a profitable activity, and financial extends loans to millions of SMEs using absolutely no one, at least directly. It's just a fixed cost. Whenever you have a change in technology, you also have a bypass of regulation, so more scope for bypass of regulation. That's, of course, a little bit the dark side. So I'm a bit concerned about the possibility of crowd lending platform without having any equity of their own. So basically, they perform intermediation, but they evade Basel III requirements. And that's not allowed, I think. I'm worried about risk selection insurance, the fact that Google or Facebook can basically select a small subgroup of people and offer them very good rates on insurance, like health insurance, which of course means that others won't get any insurance at all. And all kinds of other evasions of regulations, for example, non-discrimination regulation, because those algorithms are really quite opaque. And another thing which comes up with any new technology is the job destruction and creation. So I was mentioning Ant Financial, for example. You have a lot of job destruction. In that case, it's more an absence of job creation because the market hardly existed. The state-owned banks in China are focusing on the big firms. But definitely, there is no human intervention. At the same time, there's also job creation. So there's been some large set of entrepreneurs or merchants which have set up shop thanks to the loans they've gotten from Ant Financial. So we're going to come back to the job situation, but it's a common pattern that you get lots of destruction and creation. And the only new thing about what's happening really is that it's going much faster than ever. Going back to finance, we have worked in corporate finance for a long time, and a key concept is asymmetric information, which is the essence of financial friction. Basically, monitoring, which is motivated by asymmetric information, is a key to investor trust, consumer protection, and many other things, including prudential supervision of intermediaries. Okay. Now, it's true that with fintech, you can substitute some of the traditional collateral with reputational collateral because there is more data about you, so there is more reputation in a sense. But my view is that intermediation won't disappear with fintech. Any governance structure requires both an exit mechanism and a voice mechanism. And the voice will still be around. So if you think about VCs, block shareholders, board of directors on the equity side, of relationship banking on the debt side, you always have someone who is trying to actually intermediate and reduce the asymmetry of information, and then can bring along passive investors like limited partners or small shareholders or depositors. So a revolution, yes, but the same principle holds. Nothing very new there. On the labor front, let me be brief, but it's very, very important. And there are really two different questions. The first question is that the end of employment as we know it? Lots of people have expressed concerns about gig jobs, especially in Europe. People are really upset about this evolution. And we can ask ourselves, will there be any salaried work in the future? So will there be a big extension of the scope of independent work? There are forces in favor. And one big evolution, for example, is that now lots of people can have individual reputations. So in the past, when you were a taxi driver, you had no personal reputation. So the customers will count on the taxi company to make sure that you behave properly. So the taxi company has to discipline the taxi driver, and the only reputation was at the level of the taxi company. Now, Uber or Lyft driver can have his or her own reputation. Of course, that makes this driver a firm. This driver can also use a cheap back office or easy connection with customers, or any independent worker can do that now. So that all will say that there should be more independent work. At the same time, it's still the case that some jobs require large investments. People are risk averse. They have to offer guarantees. And when you have multiple employers, you can also have issues with confidentiality and allocation of time and effort. So my own view on this is that we should actually strive for neutrality. It's not up to the economist. It's not up to the government to decide whether independent work or salaried work is better. My own view is that we should be neutral, and the Uber driver should have exactly the same right and the same obligation as taxi drivers. And then it's up to the market and to the people to decide the way they want to organize. Second question is at the end of labor. The end of labor, economists always have fun about this because they point out, rightly so, that new jobs are always created. Sure, there are jobs which are destroyed, but there's been a lot of technological progress in the last 200 years, and we still have, at least in some countries, close to full employment. That's not the issue. The real issue is threefold. The first, which is very serious, is will the jobs be attractive, the new jobs be attractive to workers, including income-wise. We have seen a lot of increase in inequality in the last 30 years, and my guess is that it's going to continue. I don't know, it's impossible to predict, but that's certainly a concern. And if we have gig jobs which are paid very little, and if we have skilled jobs like doctors or lawyers who also become unskilled, then there will be a real issue about income inequality. Second issue is adjustment cost. Lots of people have worked, including David Otter and his co-authors, on the impact of trade or the impact of technology on mutation in the job markets. Now, take, for example, the Chinese imports in the US. They have made not only China richer, but also the US richer. But if you were a worker in the Midwest, there's no question that you have suffered because the new jobs have been created in California and they may not even have been the same jobs. So we need to make sure that those people don't suffer too much. And we have to redesign social protection. There will be a big impact on within country and also cross-country inequality. Cross-country, it has been reduced. Cross-country inequality has been reduced in the last 30 years or so. But now, with two countries dominating big data, and therefore the tech companies and soon the healthcare companies, there is a concern about cross-country inequality, which is very high. So there is no silver bullet. There will be a key role for education, continuous training, labor market institutions that protect workers but not jobs, and of course redistribution. It's easier said than done. Finally, and I think I'm running a little bit late, so you can complain if you'd like to. And stop me, by the way. Amandip, feel free to stop me whenever you want. I have two slides about competition policy. We could spend 4 hours on that, but let me just make a few remarks so as to jumpstart the discussion as well on this area. I hear more and more people asking for public utility regulation of Google or Facebook. There is a little bit of logic to that, in the sense that it's a very low marginal cost industry. But if you think about the cost of service regulation or the performance-based regulation that have been applied to telecoms and railroads and electricity company, gas companies, and so on, they are pretty hard to implement, I must say. I at least haven't seen a consistent plan for it. Why? Two reasons. The first is that it's pretty difficult to measure the firm's cost. For one thing, you will have to follow the firm over the life cycle. Not every firm's become Google, right? And therefore, you have to think about the investment made by all those firms who would like to be Google, and to think about the probability of success, which we don't really know. So it's actually hard clearly to do cost of service regulation, but even performance-based regulation will be very hard, very, very hard. The second thing, which is completely new, is that those firms are completely global firms. You know, if you think about railroad companies or electricity companies, or even the old-fashioned telecom companies, they were pretty much domestic firms. So that raises the issue of supranational regulation, which you won't have. So how do you generate proper revenues? And how do you prevent those revenues from flowing from one country to the other through international transfer pricing? We already know it's pretty difficult for taxation purposes to tax those firms because they arbitrage across countries by using non-tangibles to lower their corporate tax. And here's my last slide, and I apologize for taking so long. What about breaking up tech giants? So I've been to conferences as well in which people said, let's break up Google and Facebook. And for one thing, I'm not sure that breaking up Facebook into 5 Facebooks actually will resolve the privacy issues. But more seriously, if we were to break up Google, say, by the way, I'm not against it on theoretical grounds, but I haven't seen quite a plan for that. For one thing is you have to identify the essential facility. It was pretty easy for an electricity company or railroad company, right? For an electricity company, you know that the transmission grid is going to be an essential facility. It cannot be duplicated easily. For a railroad system, it's going to be train stations and tracks. Now, for Google, you have to say what the essential facility is. Is that the search engine? Is that the common input, the data? Is that what? And you know, those things are changing very fast, and you have to explain what the essential facility is. So, I'm not against it, but I would like to see more of a plan. I just don't see it right now. And my gut feeling to conclude is that competition policy and consumer protection, I haven't talked about privacy, but consumer protection are the main games in town. But we economists actually must work harder to adapt them to the digital context. So we have to make sure that contestability exists. So an efficient entrant must be able to enter. But furthermore, it must actually enter. So it must be the case that there is no entry for buyers. That raises deep issues about antitrust. Will you have prohibited the merger or Facebook with WhatsApp and Instagram? My gut feeling is yes, but to be honest, I have no way to bring evidence because the competition hadn't happened yet. And the question is, how do you deal with that? So we need to think hard about antitrust and its organization. And I recognize the dangers of what I'm saying, but more and more, all those big firms are swallowing up their future competitors. And then we must work harder on specific conducts. A big issue is the MFNs, the best price guarantees that Amazon and Booking and all the platforms are using to raise price. In Europe, we are reactive. In the US, nothing has happened yet. But we need to think harder about that. And also we need to think harder about how to make competition policy more agile. Maybe business review letters, maybe sandboxes, I don't know. But it's clear that if it's the only game in town, we better move faster with those things. So let me stop here and apologize. I took too long, but I'll be happy to answer your question if you have any.
Merci beaucoup, Jean. Thank you very much. Is there a burning question for Jean? Steve, go ahead.
Jean, I don't know if you could hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you, yes.
Okay, it's good to see you. So you argued in your last slide for agility, and you also talked about the rapid pace in which this digital technology environment is changing. There are a lot of voices that are trying to argue that things are fundamentally different, we need new policies, and at the same time, in my view correctly, you argue that a lot of things, basically the economic fundamentals are the same. Is there a sense in which there is room for more, let's wait and see and understand how these markets are, if at all different than historical markets? Or do you think there really is a need for rapid change in regulation and competition policy?
Well, that's a very good question. Let me just say that there are new issues, but most of the issues are old issues which are more prominent somehow. And if you take, for example, the most favored nation clauses, which are also best price guarantees, they are everywhere now. They existed before. So if you think about the no surcharge rule for credit cards, we dealt with that a long time ago because that was basically a best price guarantee. You get, if you use your card, you're not going to pay more than if you pay by cash. Now there we have designed rules which actually have been used by the European Union to try to think about how to deal with these issues. But we haven't done that for Amazon or Booking. So we economists actually need to do more on that. There are also things, there's a lot of debate, for example, about algorithmic pricing. So how do you deal with algorithmic pricing? My view is that it's going to bring things closer to the standard tacit collusion model, in which the firms find a perfect way to actually tacitly collude against the consumer, because those algorithms are so good that they will find a good way of being on the frontier of profits. And furthermore, because it's in the internet, the firms can react faster and faster. So that means that tacit collusion overall is going to be easier. So that's not new, but that means that we must be more preoccupied with tacit collusion when we deal with mergers, for example. And this issue about potential competition is a real one. No? So I'm not offering any solution to that. What I was mentioning about Facebook with WhatsApp and Instagram. Can I show that it's a suppression of competition? No, I can't. They were not competing yet. Now, WhatsApp and Instagram are social networks, so it could have been the case that they could have competed with Facebook. So I think we should have been cautious, but that requires a lot of trust in the competition authorities, right? An enormous amount of trust. So my gut feeling is that this merger should have been prohibited, but I want to be cautious with that.
Thank you, Jean. If I may add and use my moderator's prerogative to ask a question of you. You mentioned that the two games in town are competition policy and consumer protection. Now, in some cases, such as data, we've relied mostly on consumer protection so far, privacy, data protection, particularly in Europe. I heard in Brussels that there is now thinking that you need to get at data from the competition policy angle as well. If you want to level the playing field, not just for digital players, but also for companies in the old economy, the analog firms that want to use digital data to improve their own profitability, you need to make it happen. So what's your thinking about this kind of a hybrid approach?
Okay, another good question. By the way, I don't think Europe went far enough in terms of consumer protection. We have GDPR, and what I do all day long is to click and click and click, because those things are completely unreadable. And I want to go to 20 websites per day, and I don't know, the names of the companies I share with and their policies, and it will take me hours and hours. Just like with prudential regulation of banks or food safety, I will say that we need something much better. And we need some kind of libertarian paternalism where the state will intervene and at least make sure that there are 2 or 3 policies that everyone understands. I certainly don't understand what's going on, to be honest. The second thing is something you're alluding to, which is that actually the tech giants love GDPR, right? They love GDPR because it makes it more difficult to share data. So in relative terms, that means that those who have a lot of data actually are getting a competitive advantage compared to the others who don't have enough data. And therefore, that suggests that there is a tension between privacy, which is badly needed, and competition policy, because then you strengthen the current monopolies. And that's something we need to think about, because again, we haven't done a homework, which will be, okay, let's have some data sharing, but we need a new model somehow. And don't expect Google to supply to you YouTube, Gmail, Google search and so on for free. I mean, those are wonderful services if they don't get the data, because they get their revenue from advertising and from health tomorrow, from many other services. And if they don't have the data, then they are not going to supply those things for free. Now, I'm not saying the current system is good, but then you have to think about an alternative. Do you want to have micropayments? For example, we just don't know how to do it, right? Do you want to have the system in which you don't collect data? Then you throw the baby with the bathwater. Targeted advertising. Some people are upset, but I found it's great, right? Because I don't get all those ads which I have no interest in, right? I don't know. I mean, and data are going to be extremely useful for hundreds of services. So, again, I don't think we have done a homework. I don't think the current situation is good, but we need to devise new schemes, right?
Right. Thank you very much. And if there are no more questions, please join me in thanking Professor Jean Hall for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Merci Jean, bonne soirée.
Bonne soirée. Goodbye.
All right, I think that was a good start to our session today. And we will now get the moderators on stage, our panelists on stage. And Steve, why don't you join me? Let's get this going.
we just sit down?
Steve, if you move this side, then we get the numbers right.
Oh, yes, that's right. Okay.
Because you and I have the...
We do have, that's true. Okay. So, do you want to introduce folks? Okay. Thank you everyone for joining. This is very exciting, and I hope you all enjoyed Jean's great summary of some of the key issues. As an economist, I very much resonated with the way he described things and put things within the context of...
As a technologist, I resonated even more, I should say. Terrific talk.
We are now going to have a few minutes for each one of the panelists to say a few words. We have a very diverse and distinguished group over here. We have Shankar, the former dean of the School of Engineering. We have Camille, who is the deputy director of Citrus and the Banatao, am I pronouncing it correctly, Institute. We have Ajang, who's a senior advisor to the high-level panel on digital cooperation. And there at the end, we have Samir, who is a professor here at the Haas School of Business, and Jolt, another professor here at the Haas School, both lovely colleagues of mine. I think I have the order, why don't we, do we have a, I think we could just maybe start with Ajang?
I can start, yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm absolutely excited to be here to talk about the high-level panel on digital cooperation. I'm not an economist, and I'm not an expert in this particular topic of inclusivity and equality in our digital economy per se, but I'm actually here to discuss with you what we, as the panel's work have been hearing from the ground up, and to actually open up some of that discussions to the rest of the panel members and open up that discussion with the audience. So if I can do a two-line summary of the high-level panel on digital cooperation here, we're really trying to figure out the idea of cooperation. The ICT is huge for anything and everything that we would like to go forward in our future in terms of our prospering of economy everywhere in the world. Now, if we take that premise that technology and innovation is at the heart of growth, then we need to really make sure that inclusivity and equality is taken into the consideration. Now that means we as citizens in various parts of the world have to consider what are the people in African countries thinking about digital economy. What is being heard in China, for example, and how is it different than what we are hearing in Silicon Valley? And if what we are hearing is different between, for example, private sector or governments, regulatory bodies, startups to investors, then maybe there is a way that we can discuss about how we can cooperate to talk about policies, regulatory regimes, or many different mechanisms in which we can actually continue that conversation. That's where we are at today. So as part of the Secretariat for the high-level panel, we have reached out to some of the stakeholders in the African countries. And what we've heard from the ground is a little bit of pessimism. There is the notion that digital economy sounds all well and good, but maybe there is going to be a loss of digital sovereignty. That means maybe there will be a loss of the capacity for these individual countries to be able to shape their own digital economy agenda. There was also discussions that we heard from small island states where small island states have access to these digital services, such as Netflix. Their citizens are watching movies on there. But when you take a look at these over-the-top type services, then how does the taxation look like? Does that actually have the economy where the taxation actually builds the infrastructure in that particular small island states? Do they have the voice to shape the regulatory structure going forward? There's a little bit different story that we heard when we went to hear from Brussels and Europe, for example. In Europe, we heard that if the very powerful private sector companies don't necessarily play by the rules, then we need to actually figure out the regulatory structure and actually enforce that power. And throughout these different stories that we heard, data came up as one of the key focal points, because I think we're really starting to realize that with the help of AI or predictive analytics tools, data is becoming one of those things that you need to have as an asset so you can develop and participate in the digital economy itself. Now, if data is being stored or monopolized in particular powerful actors, then how can we still remain inclusive of small or medium-sized businesses? Do we have a problem where when you start your own startup, I come from a startup community myself, where you don't feel that you can compete with these larger actors such as Google and Facebook, and maybe you are taught, such as I have, that when you start a startup, you have to have an exit in mind. And by exit, that means you want to figure out how these bigger players will buy you out, and that would be the exit plan. How does that shape our digital economy going forward? I think those are some of the questions that are bubbling up as we're going around the world and listening to the different stakeholders. One very interesting experience that we've had is going to China and learning from the experiences there, where there are many things that are highly centralized that are not so centralized outside of China. And there are pros and cons that we've heard. Some of the pros is that the private and public sector work very tightly together. There are a clear set of agendas, and they're not afraid to actually push forward. That included stories of rural communities where they have access to digital economies or digital technologies so that they can foster, they can participate in that digital economy story. That may not be necessarily the case elsewhere in the world, where the market doesn't necessarily exist when you go out to the rural communities. So building the infrastructure, building access to the internet, for example, to grow that community and allow that community to build the capacity to participate, that becomes expensive. So whose role should it be to allow that to happen? Can we align some of these incentives between the larger corporations who have access to data to share that data? And can we align these incentives between the private sector, smaller companies and larger companies, as well as public sector? Those are some of the opening questions for you. And I'm very curious to hear more about what the panelists have to say so that we can integrate it into our discussions going forward.
Thank you very much. We will be taking questions at the end, so we're going to go through the panelists first. I just want to give everyone a heads up. And Camille, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and contribute to the panel. As Steve mentioned, I'm Deputy Director of CITRIS, which is an acronym for the Center for Information Technology Research in the Interest of Society. And so I also am not an economist, I'm not an engineer by training, but my remarks will focus on two separate areas that I hope will have bearing on the considerations for the high-level panel on digital cooperation. One is on the development of high-speed research and education networks for data-intensive science. And the second is on efforts to support the Sustainable Development Goals and expand digital inclusion for vulnerable populations. I have a background also at the Human Rights Center and have an interest in also looking beyond the global north to see how we can also provide greater opportunities through digital connection there. So just to start, the story of fiber optic networks for data-intensive science is fascinating. In some ways, it's as ambitious as some of the early space travel. I just saw First Man, if you saw that. It's a completely impressive operation as to how people came together to accomplish this very ambitious goal. But in some ways, data-intensive networking internationally is even more complicated because of the relationships and the cooperation that are required. New instruments like telescopes, microscopes, underwater cameras, atomic colliders are on the horizon, and these all promise to transform our understanding of the universe, our planet, and life sciences. But the quantity of data created by these instruments far exceeds anything yet captured. To fully utilize and understand the data and their implication requires integration of hardware, software, and networks, and teams of scientists and engineers every step of the way. High-speed fiber optic research and education networks have been established in regions throughout the world over the last 2 decades, and connecting these networks creates a truly global cyber infrastructure for data-intensive science, which can be accomplished only through the kind of digital cooperation that this panel could help to support. Consider for a second just what exactly fiber optic networks look like. With all these references to cloud computing and the network, it can seem kind of fuzzy and amorphous, but actually, it requires real cables, in many cases buried underwater, that come into land in real places, or you might have a piece of hardware like a satellite that you throw into the sky and then rely on to get data back to make decisions and to understand the world. So think about it just in the case of astronomy research. For example, you might have a researcher in North America who wants to observe a distant star, a planet, or a galaxy. A telescope reaches out into the universe to take a picture, say from a telescope in Chile. A computer attached to the telescope turns this image into a huge data file. The file then traverses a network from the mountaintop telescope through local networks to the regional network, but probably not even as a complete file. Rather, it needs software programming to break up the packet at one endpoint and reassemble it at the other without losing any data. To reach the scientist's lab, the data must traverse the North American regional network to, say, a campus gateway or a supercomputing center, and individually to an individual computer and screen. Now that just boggles my mind that we're able to do that, and that's just one use case. And this is exactly the kind of ambitious project that's undertaken by the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope that's being constructed in Chile right now. This telescope, the world's widest digital camera, will produce the largest evolving image of the universe when it begins full operations in 2022 to take pictures of the night sky. It will generate 15 to 30 terabytes of data every night. This 10-year survey of the sky will catalog 27 billion galaxies and 17 billion stars. Additional examples are in marine research for exploring the oceans, see Sustainable Development Goal number 14, in precision medicine, in the fields of genomics, microbiome studies, and other omic sciences, and many more. So here at the University of California, we're developing what's called the Pacific Research Platform that aims exactly to create this kind of end-to-end networking for data-intensive science. We want to look into the skies, we want to look into the ocean, look into the human body. But scaling out from here, we're also creating a national research platform and a global research platform that are building on these current efforts in international fiber optic networking. But data-intensive research over these international networks involves not just well-funded labs and institutions of higher education here in the US and Europe, but also partner organizations in the Global South. And the Network Startup Resource Center, based at the University of Oregon, works with colleges, universities, and public agencies around the world to build capacity and develop infrastructure for participating in the next generation of high-speed networking and applications in education, agricultural, and economic development that it can support. And since its founding about 20 years ago, this NSRC has facilitated the distribution of more than 650 tons of network equipment and technical reference books to engineering and computer science departments, university libraries, NGOs, and training facilities in over 120 countries, from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe. So the benefits of information communications technology and network infrastructure extend beyond scientific research, of course, to everyday transactions for education, health, and economic development that we're talking about today. How can we ensure that these benefits are equitably distributed? The International Telecommunication Union, or ITU, which is also a union agency, estimates that nearly half the world's population, so almost 4 billion people, will be online by the end of this year. But connection speeds vary significantly between the more developed northern countries and less developed south. Investments in broadband infrastructure, including upgrades to 5G, are necessary to achieve many of the Sustainable Development Goals. Many governments have a national broadband plan, and some are beginning to create national strategies for AI. But at the end of last year, less than 20% of the population in less developed countries use the internet. So let me say that just one more time. Less than 20% of the population in some 47 less developed countries even use the internet. There's also a gender gap in internet usage, and access gap in usage and access also remains, especially in these less developed countries. UN Equals is another organization that aims to address this gap and to contribute to SDG 5 on gender equality. Internet access is especially critical, and this is my second point that I just want to make, for displaced populations. A concern that cuts across several UN agencies, UN OCHA, UNICEF, UNHCR. Nearly 70 billion people are displaced globally this year. Only 40% are actually in camps. The others are in urban settings, but more than half of them are children. Digital tools in the refugee context have implications for access to information, staying in touch with distant family members and home communities, economic inclusion, healthcare, education, and more. Tending to the intersection of these displaced people and access to technology and the tools of digital inclusion will address nearly all of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Just briefly, applications of AI will affect both of these broad areas. Machine learning and machine vision are being applied to detect changes in galaxy formation, monitor forests for wildfires, detect unlawful logging or destruction of cultural heritage sites, and then also big data collection and analytics are being harnessed to predict disease outbreaks, changes in agricultural production, population movement and refugee flows, and much more. So I'll stop there and just welcome other comments and discussion as we have time.
Thank you very much, Camille. And we will move now to Zsolt at the end of the table.
Thank you, Steve, and great to be here. So digital cooperation, I actually want to share a personal story first. So when I was about 15, I had mononucleosis. That's not very serious, but you have to sit at home for like 2-3 weeks and can't really do anything. So I said like, oh, well, we got our new internet connection, modem, dial-up. Why not set up a website? So what should I set up a website about? Well, why not about my sickness? So I set up this website, and turns out there's nothing else out there. So I was like, the very early days of Google, I was one of the first hits. I was actually the first hit on there. And then people started emailing me and asking me about their prognosis and like, oh, what's going to happen? Am I going to die? It's like, well, I don't really know, but stop asking me questions. I'm not a doctor. But I figured that I just share the emails with the others. So I just uploaded the emails, imagine that, to the website without asking permissions or anything like that. But I think I created value because I connected all these people, and it became the pretty good website. As you can see, I'm here, and I'm not an entrepreneur, so I didn't sell advertising, unfortunately. But I think it illustrates the point that data can create value to consumers, and that's what I want to talk about, the role of data, especially given that, you know, how they said a couple of years ago that data was the new oil. Now they say that AI is the new electricity, and as it happens, a lot of the electricity is generated by burning oil and gas. So I see an analog here. Since most of those new technologies and new algorithms are based on data, and they need data. And a lot of this data is personal data. So the problem here is that you have your personal data, and then companies are making money on that. So that seems weird, and a lot of people feel that it's unfair. So they have this inherent concern for their data. But the problem is, I think we are not having an educated conversation about this. At least I see a lot of confusion. I assembled a panel about privacy, ethics, norms, regulation, and there seemed to be a lot of confusion. Every company said that they think they're creating value, but they couldn't articulate the value they were creating. So I think it's very important for companies to, to understand what value they are creating with the data, and then tell consumers and educate the public about that value. I mean, just a recent study about Facebook, guess how much people would need to be paid to give up Facebook for a month. It's about $50, right? So there's value for you there, and that's in exchange for your data. And of course, Facebook makes money. Facebook makes about $5 a year per account. So, just to put that into perspective. But also like retail, Amazon, you can only have Prime getting products to you the next day or the same day because they predict that there's demand for that product and they put it in the warehouse close to you, right? And that's not just your personal data, that's an aggregation of people who are similar to you, right? So there's extra value created not just from your data, but by aggregating different people's data. So the question is not as clear as it sounds. And now I come from Hungary, so believe it or not, in Hungarian, there is no word for trade-off. And that causes a lot of problems for economic policy and explaining it. But I feel like when we talk about privacy and data issues, we don't have this word in the dictionary, the word trade-off. So I think it would be important to introduce that. So I think the key is education. So before we have that big conversation about how to regulate everyone, we should have a little bit more informed conversation, policymakers, the public, the government, and they should understand what that data is doing and how it's going there. If you remember the Senate hearings, Zuckerberg's answers to the ridiculous questions, it's a great example that there's really a lack of knowledge about just even the inner workings of what's happening to data and what value it generates. And you can't do this at the national level because every piece of regulation has global effects. So GDPR, all the US startups, and mostly the startups, not the big companies, were shocked about GDPR. I have to delete my European contacts, I have to rearrange my database. So aside from the IT folks, everybody was super nervous because IT folks were well employed, so they were happy about it. And GDPR, a lot of people bring that as an example for great regulation, but it turns out it leaves a lot of gray areas. So it's a little bit like the US tax code that they make sure that they can get you no matter what you do. It's not black and white, unfortunately. Actually, the new California regulations are much more measured, and it's probably a much better step in the direction of having a conversation before doing something drastic. All right, so that's it for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Joel. We'll move over to Shankar.
I had a set of prepared remarks, but I was so happy to hear Jean Tirol's. I'd like to sort of say a number of things, really riffing off his themes. So let me tell you what's different. So digital transformation. What exactly does digital transformation mean? See, there are 4 different things going on. The Internet of Things, which are this world. We really have been able to instrument things that we couldn't instrument before, largely through wireless sensor networks, which are creating a huge amount of data. That's IoT. The second thing is cloud computing. You no longer have to own big computers to be able to do big calculations. You just turn your money over to Amazon to do it for you. No, not just Amazon, but okay, Microsoft and all the others. This is all the cloud vendors. And the third one, of course, is AI and machine learning, which is really it's been a substitute for statistics. Statistics was really about creating aggregate notions from large amounts of data. If you can deal with the data without aggregating it, without sort of having this intermediate step, your conclusions are a lot more fine-grained. So that's what AI and machine learning is. And finally, and the most important, is that we really are creating new services. These new kinds of services, the gig economy, the sharing economy, which we talked about in terms of, which Jean talked about in terms of new jobs, which are essentially new services. Uber and Lyft are really changing personal ownership of cars to making transportation as a service. For customer research management, CRM, they had a bunch of companies in the early 90s, 2000. So now we have what is called PaaS. They're called a SaaS for software as a service. So now it's platform as a service, PaaS, which really is an aggregate of these 4 large macro technological trends. And so that really is changing the world. It's changing lending, and you heard about Ant Financial, it's Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, manufacturing, condition-based maintenance. It really is going to change the world. So the questions really are, what is the glue that holds it together? And the glue that holds it together has to be how you design, how you build these mechanisms to offer these new services. And I have to say, as a technologist, I don't think GDPR goes far enough. In fact, GDPR goes the wrong direction, according to me, because privacy is not absolute. You're willing to tell your doctor all kinds of amazing things about yourself in the expectation of good service. So what privacy is really, it has a utility associated with it. Why not price privacy? Why not include privacy as a good that you can price in the act of doing mechanism design? Of course, once you do this, every economist, here's one of our experts on mechanism design, will tell you that there's free riding, and it's true. If you build, Hal Varian actually has a theorem which says that if you price privacy and you put it out, the Nash equilibrium will result in people who have high privacy settings, free riding on those who have low privacy settings. So if you have electric meters, for instance, a low privacy setting is a high frequency readout of your meter, and a low privacy setting is is every 20 minutes or something like that. And you can actually prove these. So we do need, as a society, to layer, as part of mechanism design, the social goods that we believe are important for the social good equilibrium, which is, of course, in your term, some economics is still the same, as Jean said. The price of anarchy is what it's called in game theoretic terms. But really, how you address these gaps between the societal equilibrium and the Nash equilibrium. And what is different, though, is that it's not all classical economics in my classical game theory and all that, the speed at which these things are changing. What happens with your Google Maps? One of the problems with Google Maps are wonderful ways of routing you around congestion. Except recently you might have noticed that as you try to route yourself around congestion, you in fact land up in worse congestion because everybody is taking the suggested route that was to avoid the congestion. So that means that not only do you have to pay attention to utility functions, but really to be able to understand people's behaviors as they adapt to the automation. And this is happening at internet speeds. So we have a challenge in terms of really doing the mechanism designed to be adaptive. So part of learning actually consists of trying to understand what ensembles of users do as they look at the automation. That holds for employment, that holds for things like mapping, it holds for parking apps, all of those. So I don't want to hog too much more of this and turn it over. But let me just talk about the last piece of this, which is really about development and the developing world. I think that till recently, the previous United Nations Secretary General had a scientific advisory board, and I was on this board. And in that board, in the UN SAB, there was a big discussion about the role of big data, and I think, Dr. Moon, you touched on this. The real concern about who the data analytics is good for. When you go to the developing world, you see people, you collect wireless usage data, electricity usage data in the developing world from economically disadvantaged populations, and there's a real concern about whether who the analytics benefits. And this kind of free riding that I talked to you about is really proof that unless you sort of do the analytics right with the data that you collect, you would be actually doing regressive things. In fact, we make fun of technologists who believe in congestion pricing on tolls. Congestion pricing by all standards is regressive. And you really do need to be able to put some social constructs on this. So when we talk about big data, and big data is good for the developing world and last mile electricity and all of that, we better be darn sure that in the design of the specific mechanism, we actually address social good and the good of populations. So all in all, I think it's a very exciting time really on this interplay between technology, economics, and business. And, you know, I think it's so important that we're in the act of announcing a 9-university consortium to look at digital transformation. Tom Siebel, who's a friend and benefactor, is going to help us do this. You know, it's really a big problem, big academic, intellectual problem, in addition to its being the future for a lot of these big companies. It'll have 2 European École Polytechnique and Politecnico di Torino in Europe. And we are the lead: Berkeley, Illinois, Carnegie Mellon, MIT, Princeton, and Tsinghua, and University of Tokyo. And I think that the kinds of discussions we are having, I really think how we invent the future is really at stake here. Because if not, you know, we're really going to have to be like Elon Musk and take off from Mars, you know. So this digital transformation, I think, is really about inventing the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shankar. We'll move over to Samir.
Well, I'm delighted to be here with you this afternoon, and I want to focus on a particular aspect of digital inclusion, which is about building inclusive digital cultures. And I begin my remarks with 3 core premises. And the first is that as we move to a more digital age, that implies a shift away from a world where individuals have mostly one-dimensional and enduring relationships with a handful of organizations, such as their employers or various community and civic organizations, to a world in which people are constantly building, maintaining, and discarding multifaceted relationships with a much wider range of organizations and communities. Second, we know from the vast literature on social networks that people tend to sort into relationships with very similar others, and that once they've done so, the well-understood processes of social influence often lead groups to become more homogeneous over time. And then finally, we know from the world of cultural sociology that every social group, whether online or offline, develops its own culture or set of values and norms that govern what behavior is considered appropriate or inappropriate. And that once such a culture forms, it not only perpetuates itself through the sanctioning of behavior that violates norms, but also serves to demarcate and police the boundaries of the social group. Now, if we take these 3 social forces and put them together, it's not hard to see how we can very quickly begin to create the all too familiar and increasingly widespread problems of polarization, social exclusion, and acrimonious discourse. So how do we begin to change these dynamics? Well, there is no, of course, magic elixir we can turn to. And there's a lot more work to be done to identify some solutions. But in my remaining time, I want to highlight some implications that I see for individuals, for the leaders of organizations and communities, and for policymakers. So for individuals, I think a critical new skill that people will need to develop is the ability to rapidly decipher the cultural code of a new social group. Indeed, some of my own research suggests that one's capacity for enculturation, that is, the rate at which one learns and adapts to a new normative order, often matters more for success in an organization than does one's initial level of cultural fit. At the same time, trying to fit in simultaneously to many different groups can make one's own identity become unmoored and leave one feeling socially adrift. And so I think it'll be equally important for individuals to develop the capacity to enculturate with authenticity, that is, in ways that preserve and nurture their own core values and beliefs. If we then shift to the organizational and community level, leaders increasingly, we know, are viewing culture as a strategic resource and are seeking to build strong cultures. We see it, for example, all around Silicon Valley, by hiring and socializing people for cultural fit. But in a world with high churn in group membership, even those organizations that espouse values of diversity and inclusion can quickly turn into stifling echo chambers in which dissenting views are systematically rooted out. So in addition to paying greater attention to a candidate's capacity for enculturation and receptiveness to engaging with dissimilar views, leaders should think more carefully about where in their organizations they would benefit from hiring, rewarding, and celebrating the cultural misfits and nonconformists, rather than just those who fit the existing mold. In a digital world, leaders also have access to a much wider range of tools and data sources to systematically measure and track cultural change. For example, I co-direct a research lab that uses digital traces of language use, for example, that found in email communications or Slack communications inside of organizations, to derive measures of culture and cultural fit based on the degree of linguistic alignment between an employee and his or her peers in the organization. In the future, leaders will need to build their own capacity as well as the capability of their organization as a whole to tap into these different data sources, these digital traces of behavior, and derive these behavioral rather than just cognitive indicators of cultural alignment, discord, and change. Finally, the explosion of new tools and measures of digital culture will have important implications for policymakers. On one hand, it'll be important to establish protocols and procedures that protect individual privacy and organizational and community confidential information. At the same time, there is a significant risk of overregulation, which could impair individuals' and leaders' ability to harness these digital trace data in ways that advance both individual and collective interests. Striking that appropriate balance, or the right trade-off, going back to Joel's comments, is perhaps the biggest challenge facing policymakers and will require deep engagement across sectors and disciplinary lines. With that, I'll end my comments and look forward to engaging further in our Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Samir. And I was a discussion of sorts, and I will then turn it to some Q&A. The topic that is this? I think this should be, yeah. You guys could hear me, right? The topic that was thrown in my direction was the issue related to regulation and practices that could address the potential negative effects of the digital economy, and in particular avoid stifling innovation. And when I think about that topic, which has been on my mind a lot, and it's going to echo some of the things that Jean said at the beginning, is first we need to define what we mean by negative effects of the digital economy. And as an economist, and I am a card-carrying economist, for me that means we need to think about theories of harm. In what ways are people, societies harmed by behavior or conduct in the marketplace? And most economists and many legal scholars in the area of competition and regulation typically subscribe to the so-called consumer welfare doctrine. In other words, things that make people happier, and then that's good, and things that make people less happy is bad, and things that cause more profits and efficiency are good, and things that reduce profits are bad, and we need to find some way of weighing profits and consumer happiness. So that then leads to the next obvious phase, or at least I think obvious, of once we have clear theories of harm, then we need to think about remedies for those theories. And this is where I very much subscribe to one of the things that Jean said, where the fundamentals of the economics are the same. One of the wisdoms from the Bible, if I may, go to an older text, is in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 9, where I'm quoting, because I always remember the last part, but what has been will be again, what has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. And there are so many fundamental aspects of economic behavior, economic interaction, social interaction, and social behavior that are just more of the same. They're just happening in the digital world instead of the offline world. Historically, there were certain things I could only do with my neighbors that now I could do with people who live, 8,000 miles away. But the types of behavior, the types of interaction, many of them are the same. So we need to be very careful. I'm not saying we shouldn't do this at all, but we need to be careful before we jump to the kind of conclusions of, oh, things are so different now, we need to do things differently when it comes to regulation and enforcement. Third, we know that competition, more often than not, is something that leads to innovation, to better welfare, and so on. So we need to understand the nature of competition, in particular, barriers to entry. Let me take the example that Jean gave of Facebook buying Instagram and WhatsApp. Jean said it very eloquently. Does he have any proof that this stifled competition and reduced welfare? No, but his gut tells him that probably this shouldn't have been allowed. And like him, I don't have any proof, and my gut tells me that I don't know if it shouldn't have been allowed for the following reason. All these technologies, just think for a second about WhatsApp and think for a second about Instagram. This ain't rocket science, okay? These are very simple algorithms. Furthermore, back 10 years ago, 15 years ago when these things started, in order to build these companies, you needed a tremendous amount of capital expenditure because you needed to buy your own servers. As Shankar mentioned, today, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, Oracle has their cloud, and so on. They have turned cloud computing into sand and oil. It is a commodity, and it is dirt cheap. Here's some facts from a very recent paper that just came out in the National Bureau of Economic Research. From 2009 to 2014, when AWS practically was the only game in town, prices of their services were declining about 13% a year, even without competition. In 2014, that's really when Azure and Google Cloud stepped up and started investing heavily. Since then, prices went down by about 25% a year. This is a commodity, which means that entering into these markets has become extremely cheap. So we really need to understand barriers to entry, whether things are becoming easier or harder. If when Facebook bought Instagram, it made it harder for other firms to enter, well, that's a problem that we need to regulate. And if the change in technology is just making everything easier for entry, then we maybe ought to step back. And the last point that I want to make on this, and this is the one that I find the most challenging, is that regulation, by and large, is a national, or in the case of the EU, somewhat regional game, okay? And the digital economy has transformed the distance, right, and the geography of interactions more than anything ever has, right? I mean, turn the clock back probably 2,000 years, it was horses, and then maybe 1,000 or 600 years ago was ships, and then trains, and then planes. What the internet did to global exchange is truly transformative. And just as an example, think of a company like Upwork, which is a labor service company. You want someone to design your webpage, you go to Upwork, you say, this is what I need, and people from all over the world could apply for that job. And I could hire a web developer from Bangladesh who just 10 years ago had no shot in hell of getting any kind of decent work. So how do we square that tension that all regulatory environments are practically national, where the digital economy, by definition, is a global economy? And that's where I think that efforts from the UN and such panels are instrumental. Of course, I wonder where the political teeth, where is the kind of pressure to create the kind of cooperation needed for a global regulation, because these really are global industries. So I will stop with that. And
Right.
would you like to maybe take over for a bit?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Steve. We'll give you. Thank you to you and to all our panelists for excellent follow-up to Jean Tirol's scene setting. And now is the time when we broaden the lens and draw you in and try and get some more granularity on the questions raised by the panelists. Shankar, you may have to leave in between, so you're excused. Whenever you have to leave, do. But I just wanted to make a point about the 9 university consortium you mentioned. The panel is looking for what we call implementation champions. So institutions who help us co-construct some of the knowledge coming out of the process, who own up some of the recommendations that we will put out at the end of May next year. And then we
Sign us up.
Exactly. So sign you up and then build a partnership for capacity building around the world for thinking about the digital transformation, something that is lacking very much and is a concern. So
Can I
Yes,
say,
please.
respond to Steve? Because, you know, I think, Steve, at the end of what you said, you answered your question about what's different. What's different, I think, these technologies are actually pushing us away from excessive nationalistic points of view. Everything about these technologies is pushing us away from regulation at the national, regional, etc. level, because distance as distance or locality is lost. And so I think that, so the questions are how you look out for the interests of a broader population than North America or the European Union. I think we have a chance to do something right, really for, for the world at large and for larger sections of the world in regulation whereas I think current regulations are really, because they're really aimed at reinforcing nationalist, I think they're going the wrong direction.
Mm-hmm. Right. And apart from the national, international aspect, regulation comes wrapped up in digital technology. So architecture is policy in digital technology. So that's another challenge to policy making today. But we need to open it up, and I see that one of you has already seized the opportunity. The mics are there on the side, so please walk up to the mic, line up if you have to, and ask your question. Please introduce yourself briefly, and if you have a specific panelist you would like to address your question to, please name the panelist.
Thank you very much. So my name is Arturo Perez-Reyes. I teach here at Haas. I also have a day job in information security, so I thought a lot of the discussion on that part was a little optimistic, but I'm going to give you something more pessimistic. So the very first speaker talked about the fact that the jobs are being lost in the rural areas, and that's exactly what's been going on since the mechanization of agriculture, but we're dealing with a much faster transformation right now. So if you saw the latest McKinsey report, by 2030, they could, their optimistic point of view is 30% of the jobs will turn over. Pessimistic view is 60% of the jobs will turn over. So this is happening very, very quickly, and you already see the reprisals happening. So in Hungary, in Poland, in Brexit, and with Trump, you see that the rural America, rural peoples are being left behind, and they're not happy about it. So this is a much bigger political challenge, actually, than it is an economic challenge. And it's not being helped very much by the Frankensteins that have been created. Like Facebook's a pretty good example of a creature that's been lost control. And so, in many, many ways. And so it's killing democracy, it's killing, it's making it possible to radicalize large groups of people. So, to the panel, these are real political issues, right? The fourth industrial revolution really could fail. And to Steve's point is it's not incremental. Well, there's a very famous economist who thought that these things were not, that we went through punctuated equilibrium, and basically thought the capitalism would end because there wouldn't be any consumption anymore, because people wouldn't have any work. I'll leave it to that.
Thank you very much. So that's a tough one. Who wants to have a go at this? Steve, you want to answer that?
I could answer that, definitely not, but I could offer some comments. So thank you for that. And I think one of the critical words you put on the table here, it's a matter of political will and political discourse. And I say this because as an economist, I care more about efficiency than anything else. Economists could have a view on equality or inequality, on different other aspects of moral judgment, but let's be honest in calling them moral judgment, right? If I ask myself, do I have the tools or authority to say whether it's good or not to take $10 away from Mark Zuckerberg and give them to a hungry child in Africa, I am taking away something from one person and giving it to someone else. So I'm making one person worse off and one person better off. You could argue that $10 from Mark Zuckerberg is not even a drop in the bucket, which of course I agree. But I don't have the tools to say this is what we ought to be doing. That said, and I'll take off my economist hat, it's clear that the signs we see from Brexit, from what's happened in the United States, from the extreme right nationalistic movements that are just growing everywhere. I spent half my life in Israel. The same is happening there. It's very troubling. And we clearly don't have, or at least it seems to me that we clearly don't have, the mechanisms and the political will to create true safety nets, to find some way of describing a situation of distribution of these gains in ways that does not leave people behind. But the bottom line is this is a political issue more than anything else. And as an economist, I don't have tools to solve that. That's why I'm not offering an answer, but agreeing that this is something fundamental that needs to get a lot of attention.
Right, and if I may add to that, some of the things we're hearing in our engagements is one, that there needs to be massive investment in reskilling and reorienting education curriculum at a scale that's not been imagined before. And we need to prepare our children for a future where jobs, the nature of jobs, the content of jobs will be very, very different from today. The other thing we are hearing is the need for reorienting education so that there is more responsible innovation. Those of you who study medicine are very well aware of how the ethical interdisciplinary element is brought into education. But I'm an engineer, and I know for a fact that in engineering education, it's not done that way. So we need to reorient engineering education fundamentally. And maybe some of the panelists can go into that eventually. And then this point about leadership. Leadership is about shaping the marketplace as well through smart regulation, not over-regulation, not under-regulation. Smart regulation that allows local context to be the driver of digital businesses, local data to be the driver of the digital economy. Sir, you've been waiting very patiently, so...
Yeah, I just want to say, as an engineer and a head of an angel fund, ex-Cisco guy, helped start the Google Developer Groups. What's really interesting and is important, I think points you brought, they're all pieces of the elephant we all have to lift together. I think the question is if we look at ways of maybe finding the right mouse to scare it or the right banana to get it to move, because even if we don't agree what the elephant is, we still can't pick it up. That's why I think the earlier discussion and point by the panelists where you said, really isn't about regulation. It's impossible to regulate things across transnational borders in most cases. The CRISPR example shows you. But there is possibility to come to consensus around standards and frameworks to moderate and to enable fair transactions, transparent transactions that enable disruption of things that aren't in the public good, because the users who have data and actual revenue can vote at scale around the world to not support large infrastructures that don't benefit them. And what one of the big motivations people need to look at in this discussion is in the next 25 to 30 years, we have to double the amount of food we can yield. We have major impacts and data points from IoT to manage the effects of weather and global warming, what you may not believe in, but we're seeing it from a scientific point of view. So there are requirements that are going to make that happen. And the companies and governments and regulatory environments that enable that thing to happen in a good disruption will get the resources and the support. Now, the question is, how does the UN and transnational organizations come to an international consensus and framework that they promulgate as a best practice that people adopt and governments adopt and companies adopt? And there have been a lot of good examples of that, like the stuff that people did with the Ushahidi third world open source, a framework for data mapping, saved lives in Haiti, and it's been used in the first one in America for everything from crime spotting and weather issues. It was adopted because it was a best practice. Groups like the UN and others can promulgate it. People like the World Bank supported the early groups doing it, and it led things with big companies supporting it and large nonprofits at scale around the world. So the question is, how do we get two things that enable that? One, on this larger scale, how do we get to a consensus on a framework and best practices? And also on the micro scale, how do we give control of that access to the data that these large institutions need to succeed and do this and prosper to the individual's citizens? That's the piece where if we don't have a way of tracking or letting people say, own their data and own the transactional value for giving permission for people to access it and even using the device they own or subsidizing the device they own with their having control of their data, like OAS starts to do. We have to have a thing where people can say, no, when I log into Facebook or Google, I'm not just gonna say they can access this. I should be able to say which data I'm gonna let them to access, and like you said earlier, what the value of that is. Because as an economist, you can't tell Mark, I know him personally, you can't tell him he's gonna pay 5. But if you let him know when he tried to give away free internet, you know, Mark, if you give away free phones with that and don't just make him go to Facebook, you'll make 25 and people will give you $30 worth of value. He'll do that right now because his stock's down 40%. Right. So that's kind of the question I want to ask. Are there efforts and are there things you're looking at to build frameworks and best practices that the UN sponsored groups can say this is a best practice at scale around the world, this is a solution regionally, first world, second world, third world, fair, transparent data transactions? Because we're already seeing with blockchain and other things, like people doing this. What they're doing is in the Wild West. With CRISPR and things like that, it's going to accelerate. With neural data, it's going to accelerate. With 5G, it's going to accelerate. So how do we build structure and frameworks? What groups should be tasked to allow those frameworks to be put out, people give comment on it, and follow
Thank you.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
I'm thinking that maybe Camille and Ajahn,
Yeah.
a lot of the international issues were around your topics. Maybe you could say a
Yeah.
few words on that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, and going back to the previous question as well, I think that yes, there are certainly dangers in the digital technologies accelerating the polarization of political opinions and perhaps destabilizing some of the former social frameworks and networks that were support networks that were in place before. At the same time, I think that, you know, of course, digital technologies also provide greater transparency in some cases once you have these open data movements and other efforts around the world around transparency as far as political decisions, you know, even down to the very local I paid a bribe type apps that are going to expose the misdeeds of local actors, that those are also empowered by the internet. But one key aspect of that I think also touches on the recent question is the importance of digital literacy. And yes, it's very important at the UN level to establish these frameworks and organizations that everyone can sign on to, but down to the reskilling and creating an empowered digital citizenry, I think it's really essential that people have a better understanding of what digital technologies can and can't do, how to have a better critical assessment of what is real and what is doctored or, you know, put together using new technology tools. It's a Janus-faced coin as far as many of these technologies go.
Yes, to address the two-layered question that was just asked, I think that's actually the question that we're trying to address as part of the panel's project, because it is really about the how. Can we even think about this novel type of framework to allow an international consensus to be formed? It's an incredibly big challenge with a large scope under the umbrella of digital cooperation. And I think the homework is really ahead of us. This is part of the research process where, at the end of our process, this is a very short 9-month process, by the way. So at the end of, a later part of next year, we'll have a final report that touches on that particular subject. So that is to say that we are welcoming your inputs on what that could be. I mean, we've heard some ideas from different corporations that said, 20% of our corporation employees' time is actually marked for their own projects, because we understand that these employees spending time to contribute to open source projects, for example, that's actually really important, because open source projects are not necessarily funded like other software projects. So that actually is a form of cooperation that we don't necessarily talk about at the international level. So can we even scale that, or can we even pick up other examples where we can
International standards too, like OAuth. Like these standards, they're open to everyone. One of the things that's going to happen, and I'm going to move on and give it space, but I have to say this. We know on the mobile side at 5G, not just fiber, but 5G around the world with blockchain, and with a great group here at Blockchain at Berkeley is doing some really important things in that space. Groups like the Law Lab that's here and at Haas in San Francisco. There is discussion where people are using open source standards to scale around the world, and because there is nothing in all these places, and there's really nothing, like the CRISPR, people watch the CRISPR discussion and what happened, where China had to look to research groups to give them guidance about what they should regulate. Literally, you have the opportunity at the UN level to bring together the different groups who should be talking to each other, and then say, let's come to a consensus. We're literally doing it right now with MIT for the election hacking stuff. So I'll leave it at that, with the audit stuff, and
Thank
hopefully
you.
you can follow up and post.
Thank you very much. Let's go that side and give that lady the opportunity to ask a question.
Hi, my name is Troy Reyes-Stone, and I think my question is a little bit in line with prior questions, but I think it's a little more directed at Samir. But kind of going off of what Shankar said before he left about the kind of irony that this technology is kind of denationalizing, and at the same time right now we can really see that it's been aggressively nationalizing lots of people and places. We have this populist movement, and we have this huge growth in identity politics right now in the United States, which kind of goes off of the whole idea of digital culture, I think. And I know you were kind of talking about it at like a corporate level, but all of these things are being manufactured through an idea of creating digital cultural spaces and then kind of radicalizing within those. And that's why you're having all these like lone attacker terrorists that come out of nowhere because they've been radicalized from overseas, and where you get, as I said, these populist movements. So how do you think we can kind of tackle the idea of these like digital cultures that have been trying to divide us and create not digital cooperation, but more factionalization? What would you suggest?
Yeah, so a few thoughts. This is an active area of research across disciplinary lines. So in political science, sociology, economics, psychology, this is a very active area of research. I would say one of the things I would think about is individual differences in the kinds of people who are prone to polarization. So, for example, there's a relatively new scale developed in social psychology called receptiveness. And it's an 18-item measure that assesses the degree to which you are willing to engage with and feel negatively about and judge and condemn people who hold opposing views from your own. Right? And it turns out we have a research study using the scale where people who are high in receptiveness, that is, they're less prone to those tendencies, are much less likely to sort into homogeneous networks, much less likely to refer friends of friends to make ties to one another, which are some of the mechanisms by which you get these very closed groups forming. So one thing we could start to do is to try to look at the kinds of people who are entering or not entering a group. Right now, this is a psychometric scale, but over time, you could imagine behavioral indicators of one's propensity to become balkanized, and then begin to screen and select people somewhat on that basis. The other, I think, and this I think relates to some of my comments earlier, the tendency to screen and select on what we consider cultural fit is pernicious because it's very hard to actually gauge the extent to which somebody will fit in culturally. What we're usually assessing is how similar is this person to me on a variety of observed but also unobserved traits. And so for those who are curating these groups and trying to avoid those tendencies, I think thinking about other ways of reaching out to people, not just based on perceived cultural fit, is going to be really important. Those are just two ideas that come to mind.
Thank you.
Right, and we'll be pursuing this topic of social trust, digital trust, through an event in London at King's College London next week. So keep track of that on the website, because there's a lot of research going on, not just here, but in Institute of Technology Delhi, in institutions in London around this duty of care, trust dimension of digital technologies. Madam, over to you.
Thank you. I'm Brandy Nonnicki. I'm the director of the Citrus Policy Lab, and I work very closely with Camille. And I'm picking up on the points from Zolt, Shankar, and Steve, that we live in a world of trade-offs. So with greater inclusion in the digital economy brings great rewards of economic and social inclusion, but also great risk, right? Smaller firms must now compete with larger firms. You can be trapped in political homophily on social media. And also a topic that I think we haven't really spoken a lot about here, and I think it's very important, around surveillance and the aggregation of data to make decisions on our behalf. And so I wanted to pose to the panel, what is the panel's position on the construction of these data scores, like social credit scoring, and their use to make decisions on behalf of people and their access to information, resources, and services?
I guess that falls to me, so I don't know what the panel's position is. So my position in general is that the more government-related than agencies, the less I want them to have my data. But, so I'm in marketing, and I think marketing would be probably the less nefarious or the least dangerous. Like, I get an ad, I get an ad because of my data. It's not such a big deal. But even then, what I would argue for is that anytime there's a decision made based on some sort of data that included my data or others, it should be transparent. So like in the ad context, and they do have some programs for that, but not widely adopted, unfortunately, is that every ad you see, you could click on a little button that would show you like, hey, we access this data point, this data point, this data point about you, and this is exactly why we showed you that ad.
But you might also not see what they're not showing you. So are they not showing you housing in certain neighborhoods?
Yeah, so that's a enforcement question of like whether this kind of policy could be enforced or not. If they want to hide, I mean, there's lots of like, even with the GDPR consent, like, you know, how Jean-Tirole was talking about clicking and consenting. So there's these strings in the background that go around that you consented. So there's even fraud going on about consent strings. Because publishers, if I have a website, I want to say that my visitors consented. So I fraudulently send over a consent string that is not a real consent. So there's enforcement is a different level of question. But I think at the first level of transparency, at least to have a list of data points that were used, I think that would be a good first step.
Can I just add on this? It's kind of a timely question. I don't know if you all have been following this discussion around UC Berkeley startup called Predictum that uses social media feeds in order to give caregivers, babysitters, a score to the parents who might want to hire the babysitter about whether they are trustworthy or not, which I find completely problematic. I mean, this isn't even like government surveillance, it's just a marketing company, and they say that they can't tell you why you might have scored one way or the other because it's a trade secret, it's part of their, you know, special algorithm. So there has been some flack, including pushback from Facebook and Twitter, who say this is violating our terms of service. But I can think that this isn't going to be the only instance of how that works. And we heard right here on the stage from Kai-Fu Lee a while ago about use of a similar kind of algorithm in China for giving immediate feedback on whether you're eligible for a loan or what other kinds of credit transactions.
Yes, the social credit.
On the social score, you know, it's clearly a fascinating topic because If you dial the clock back about 200 years, then what's happening here would be, fantasy. Just here on the podium, there are people representing at least 4 countries that most likely are not within the next week are going to be in 3 different countries on airplanes, and in the room there are probably another 17. 200 years ago, if not even only 100 years ago, most people didn't leave the vicinity of their village. Everybody had a social credit score, and everybody in their village knew exactly what that social credit score was. It was through gossip and so on. Then over the years, we turned into this very anonymous society, and now we have a technology that suddenly puts us back in a village, right? So it is a very difficult issue to deal with, because for millennia, we relied on these social scores to know who to trust and who not to trust. Who do I want my child to marry, and who would I rather them not marry? And then things became democratized and anonymized, and now maybe there's pressure to go back to that other model. So I think this is a very interesting debate. Again, I have no answers, but there are very interesting parallels, I think.
And it's not just the states that are implicated, but also corporations. I mean, you mentioned this aspect about the cultural fit,
Yeah.
but look at the other side of it, the black mirror side of it, where it could be used to shape people into conformity. You have business models like Traity, Traity in Spain, that allocates scores, personal trust scores. So how's that different from? So it's a very complex issue. And then the thing that we have to, the panel doesn't have a position yet. We're studying this, and we are looking at the trade-offs and the combinatorial effects. You connect national ID, digital ID scheme to a social credit score. The risks are much, much more than when those two sit separately. So those are the kind of issues that we are looking at. And it's not just one country problem or 2 countries. Now, I can think of at least 3 airports in Europe that are using algorithms for screening with very, very high error rates, 30% plus. And that's a problem.
Yeah.
Sir.
Hello. Yeah. I'm Ankit. I'm a first-year student at the School of Information. And my question is regarding, as you rightly said, that currently all policies are nationalized, and the companies that we have, they can be targeted across borders, because right now in our current digital economy, we have sets of data centers where you can look at. But as we come towards future and go towards a decentralized economy, for example, with blockchain, what kind of position would you take, and what kind of policies would you make? Because now the policies need to be something that can govern across borders. And how do you approach such a problem while working with the current problem right now?
Now you're looking at me. My quick answer is the reason Berkeley admits brilliant people like you is so that you, in a few years, will be able to answer that question. Because that is a very hard question. There are no international political teeth, as far as I know, with all due respect to the UN. Right? And so there's a lot of voluntary involvement. There are a lot of treaties. There are gains from standardization, so that on many levels, it is in the interest of companies and societies for there to be standardization. But these are very hard things to coordinate, let alone enforce.
Right.
So I don't have an answer.
So we have just a couple of minutes left and 2 questions. Maybe we can take the 2 together, and then you want to come in. And we can have something offline on what the UN does. I mean, you're all connecting to Wi-Fi. Those standards have been developed in the UN, and there are many other ways in which the UN offers a platform for collaboration and cooperation. But quickly, 1-line, 1-sentence questions from both of you.
Well, I'll give it my best shot. I'm Morgan Ames. I'm the Associate Director of Research for the Center for Science, Technology, and Medicine Society here at Berkeley. I also teach in the School of Information. So I'm thinking about your example of the small village and how everyone had a sort of social credit score. And I think that it's very important to learn from history. Too often we think of technology is the end of history. However, I would caution against kind of false parallels with history. And I think that in this case, it's very important to consider who is implementing these social credit scores, what kind of power they have, what the what the pathways for recourse are, what due process might look like. Just last week, with the collaboration of Citrus and others, we brought Virginia Eubanks onto campus, and she gave a really fantastic talk about poverty and the impact of the digital on poverty and the really specific differences. She's a historian, she's deeply versed in the history, but I worry a lot about what are the specifics that are different and how does the digital allow us to scale and to reinforce inequalities when equity is not built into the system from the beginning.
Hi, my name is Kafa, and I wanted to know, when you were doing these conversations about digital economy and regulations, you said that you had conversations with African countries and China. So how do you tailor your questions to the economy you are reaching out to? Because for emerging digital markets like my country in Senegal, we are very different from the United States. We are not as present in the market, and we have different needs and wants. So how do you ask the appropriate questions to get like sensitive information to better design these regulations?
Okay. Ajeng, you want to have a go?
Sure. So I can tackle that last question there. So we're actually engaging with different stakeholders in many different ways. One of them is to attend events like this, where we have this wider conversation. Another method is to have one-on-one conversations with key stakeholders, to be able to have these sensitive but closed doors discussions, so that we get an honest truth about what should be, what question actually makes sense in that context. And other ways we have been engaging is also have open doors. We have many ways in which we are collecting submissions from different organizations all across the world. And that also includes online surveys that you can also take as well. So in terms of tailoring some of the questions, and I think we are in that learning process of actually having a conversation and learning as we go, if that is sufficient answer.
We'll be going to Western Africa, to Cotonou, early next year for a conference there that brings together, because that part of Africa feels left out of the digital transformation. We have a team going to Nairobi next week, so that's also part of our reach out to Africa. I think we've run out of time, but I wanted to give Dean Tyson an opportunity to say something. I mean, you started us off with a brilliant introduction.
Well, I would like to say that I know that the panels go around the world, and I know that you're reaching out, and I'm sure you're very aware of, and it's very important, the cultural and national differences. I mean, digital sovereignty came up early as a term, and I think that's important. I would say here, one of the things that I heard, and it might help your work, because it's such a big topic, and maybe it was a little bit of what you started with Jean Tirole and also with Steve. Think about the areas where, what is a bad effect? I mean, a bad effect in what? There's a bad effect in competition policy, or maybe there's a bad effect in labor markets. Because it is so broad, the topic, that I think actually focusing on sort of that kind of question might help. The other thing I would say I've heard, and it's my own sort of the way I got involved in this, is that Jean said at the beginning that he was concerned that what digital technologies were doing were increasing inequality. And I think I'm very concerned about that. And I think if you take you're working on recommendations for sustainable, just, and inclusive, thinking about negative effects in certain areas where the negative effect also has to do with the income inequality or the wealth inequality is a way to focus. And I guess the last thing I would just say, we're having I guess the UN is now calling, and maybe it's happening right now, a climate summit in Poland. And I think to the extent that you can think about this whole area of digital inclusion and what is the thing that includes all of us, the health of the planet, is a way to kind of bring together the climate focus of the UN and this focus. So those are just some observations. I love the idea of inclusive of implementing institutions.
Implementation champions.
And champions, because I think that UC Berkeley can definitely be a champion and an implementing institution, and the various think tanks that you've heard around here can also be involved in that. That's very exciting. We're happy to work with you. Thank you. Thank you for coming very much and sharing this vision with us, and we hope we can work with you.
Thank
All right.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.